some people said they would be willing to pay $1 million a year for access to it instead of hiring, 10 engineers for 100 or 200 grand each. So the timing of this announcement is quite interesting. Maybe it's a way to combat some of these developer agents.
I would be curious to see, could they get into all these specialty areas, or are they going to stay in the fat part of the market and allow all of these niche applications to actually serve those very detailed services? I guess it's the same democracy of the communist leadership election of the Liberal Party when you start knocking off some candidates for some bizarre reasons. We say democracy in Canada, but really, what does that really mean anyway?
Welcome back to the tank, John. How you been? You were out on the West Coast, I heard, at the Upfront Summit. How was it?
It was good. There was a moment there that the Canadian contingent that was going down was sort of wondering, do we really want to supply the U.S. government with our dollars and stuff? And what was kind of funny was as I was mulling it over, Mark Suster had sent me a note, and all it said is, "John, I just want to let you know that us Americans love you Canadians, and please don't blame us for the guy in the White House."
Oh, that's funny. Yeah. So for people who don't know, Mark Schuster, the founder of Upfront Ventures, obviously a very well-known venture fund in LA, hosts an annual conference called the Upfront Summit, which brings together obviously tech leaders, investors, operators, and things like that. And it's been going on for how long, John?
Probably around, I think about 17 years, and I've been going to it for 15 of those years. Yes.
Yeah.
So I've
always heard such a great thing. Old schooler. Yeah. Well, hopefully I'll be there next year. But let's jump into it. So the first thing, obviously, I want to jump into is on the political side here. We've got obviously an election, or sorry, not an election, but a nomination for the Liberal Party coming up quite soon. And I guess the question, has your views changed on whether or not we will have an election in end of April, beginning of May? Because as it stands right now, if Mark Carney is the one who takes the path to prime minister for the Liberal Party, he does not have a seat in Parliament.
Correct.
Now, a seat is not required, though, because under Canadian rules, prime ministers do not need to be an MP to take office. But there are obviously historical precedents around this. I'm not sure if you remember. I wasn't around, but I looked it up. Basically, past prime ministers like John Turner took office without a seat, and then quickly called an election, and then also and he lost that election, and William Lyon Mackenzie King held office seatless, but soon won a by-election. So there is precedence around not having it, but what do you think will happen here, given that we're still sitting in a prorogue parliament until March 24th?
I think that based on my understanding, they want to call an election as soon as possible. The rumor mill has an election being called as early as March the 16th, with a view of the election date being April the 22nd. And also, I think it's going to be a short election. The longer it is, the Conservatives have far more money in the bank, so the advantage would go to them. So I think that it's going to be a very, very short election. And I think that the Liberals will want to take advantage of some of the momentum that they had recently. And perhaps if this whole Trump and U.S. fiasco continues, is that going to work against the current government is perhaps the thinking. So I'm going to bet still an April election.
Yeah, are you still going on the bet also that there's going to be a Conservative majority, or is that now in doubt?
Well, I'm going to still stick to the Conservative majority. Now, I think when you and I had made our predictions, I wasn't as bullish as you were in terms of the size of that majority. I was always expecting that majority amount was really part frustration with Justin Trudeau and part with the Liberals. So, having a majority in the 190 to maybe 200 range feels where I think it may land. But certainly the gap has closed quite considerably.
Yeah. So for people who don't know, the seat majority needed is 172. Projections actually had shown them slipping from 181 down to 177, while the Liberals have climbed to now 120. So it is moving around quite a bit here as we head into this.
but it depends on which poll you look at. The last two polls, Leger and I think the other one had
Ipsos
a
was one.
yeah, had 193 as well too. So, you know, this is the problem. Again, we talked about this in the US election. You have clearly some pollsters that are acting like the mainstream media with a clear
Yes.
bias to one party and the other. I think that they're creating a massive disservice to the reliability of polls. And I know it's somewhat scientific, but it's seemingly getting more political.
It definitely does. And speaking of political, I don't want to believe I'm saying this, but do you hear what Elizabeth May is saying, floating the idea of joining forces with the Liberals and the NDP, where
Yeah.
you're going to have a coalition of the NDP, the Liberals, and the Green Alliance to shift the balance of power, to basically prevent a conservative majority?
I know
I mean,
it's
what happened to democracy there?
yeah, well, I guess it's the same democracy of the communist leadership election of the Liberal Party when you start knocking off some candidates for some bizarre reasons. It's
Hmm.
already coronated that it's going to be Mark Carney. And I think what the Liberals were doing there was trying to avoid the criticism that Kamala Harris had, where they coronated her and were subject. But you're kind of doing all of the things to make sure that there is only one candidate. So we say democracy in Canada, but really, what does that really mean anyway?
Yeah, well, it's showing up in the numbers, John. Something if we go back to the Wayback Machine with you and I, we talked about, which is the immigration surge happening in Canada. Some data that came out recently indicates a striking rise in Canadians leaving the country. In 2024, national immigration hit its highest level since 2017, with over 81,600 residents moving abroad. Half of those came from Ontario. So, what are your thoughts around this? We're starting to see it. It was around the capital gains raise time that you mentioned it, and
Yeah.
it looks like the numbers proved you right.
Yeah, all of these folks that were criticizing you and us, oh, you're fear mongers, no one's going to leave. And you and I kept on saying, dudes, we know who's leaving. I know who they are. I'm
We've
not going to,
received the long distance calls from down south.
yeah, well, three of them, I'm talking to them. I didn't even know, and I know these guys very, very well. And it's very, very disturbing. And you could criticize and say, oh, they're not patriotic and whatever nonsense you want to say. The troubling aspect, if you have wealth, you can do it, very easily. And they didn't care about, by the way, the disposition tax on
Right.
immigration, by the way. Or
Hmm.
number two, which is even more troubling, go to the universities, particularly, the engineers, and look at what they're doing. There was a very troubling email that I saw from Gary Tan on YC,
Yep.
Y Combinator, saying, "Hey, the Canadian students, boy, just have them set up here because they're flocking to us." Like, what what more anecdotes do you continue to need to rely upon to suggest that we have an issue here? And again, it's not to criticize, but it's to solve.
John, you're speaking to the person who's seeing it on the ground level, and I'm glad you bring it up. It's not just retirees that are emigrating to the States. It's actually newly minted founders. So Bram Sugarman, who you and I know well,
Yep.
one of your old colleagues at Omer's, former Shopify, posted a tweet the other day about how the rise in Canadian companies that are in the YC batches hit an all-time high, obviously during COVID in the sort of 2021, 2022 batches. Now, those were much larger batches,
Yeah.
but it sparked a huge conversation on Twitter where Gary Tan replied and said, the Canadians stay in the USA and raise more money. The ones that stay in San Francisco after demo day become unicorns at 2.5x the rate. I had a pod dinner tonight, and our whole row of founders I sat in turned out to be Canadians who are all going to base their startups in San Francisco after demo day. So this was a huge sort of, gathering of thoughts that Gary just unleashed around the
Yeah.
Canadian venture capital community. And it's just true. I mean, we have obviously our theory around this at Ripple, where we invest prior to most companies going even into YC, but even the companies that we have back that are Canadian, some of the executives have already moved down to the States to build out the rest of the teams. And it's just a fact that it's because the market is there, the opportunity to raise capital is there, and the opportunity for larger partnerships or hiring and things like that are there. So he's just saying what we're all seeing, right?
I know. I just wish he didn't say it, but he he spoke the truth. I want to say, Gary, shut the fuck up. Uh, but then on the other, then I quietly
I
tell
hear
him,
you.
I know it's true, dude, but please, you're killing us.
But you know what's interesting, John, about this topic that it always seems to come up every single month or so is that we have the recipe here, the
We do.
recipe of bright minds,
We do.
bright
No question.
opportunities. Everything is here for a good ecosystem to continue to thrive. But again, it's around access to capital and the policies surrounding, the views in which entrepreneurs are viewed by the rest of the society. I think it's those kind of things that will have to be figured out. And hopefully we're only a few months away from that changing. But hey, look, Canadians are still making headlines, John. The 2024 Turing Award and the Nobel Prize for Computer Science went to the inventors of reinforcement learning. Andrew
Yep.
Barto and the former PhD student Rich Sutton, famous for his essay on bitter lessons, and what wrote basically the foundation for ChatGPT post-training, AlphaGo, along with robotics and so much more, received their award. So do you know Richard Sutton at all? Canadian
I,
computer
I
scientist?
mean, I don't know him personally, but I by reputation, of course.
Of course. I mean, he works, I believe, with the team at Framework, if I'm not mistaken. But there just seems to be more and more Canadians that are obviously getting global recognition, which is great. But again, are these people staying here and
Stay
working
here.
and commercializing
Right.
a lot of the technology that they are at the forefront of creating? So kudos to Richard Sutton and Andrew Barto. But again, another Canadian getting an award that seems to having their brains commercialized down south. Speaking of down south, John, I gotta jump into this right now. It's the CoreWeave IPO. You and I have been having conversations about
Yes.
this. And so, for our listeners who don't really know much about what's going on, CoreWeave, they made a bet early on in the sort of GPU race, and they stockpiled a lot of these GPUs, NVIDIA GPUs, ahead of a lot of the demand that was obviously going to be coming later on. And so, for people who aren't really aware of some of the numbers, it's quite staggering how quickly they grew their business. I mean, they literally went from nothing to billions in revenue within a year's span. And now they're taking advantage of that by going out for an IPO here, which may or may not be at the right time. But what are your thoughts on this, John? Tell our audience a bit more about this story that you are reading about.
Well, let me be extreme. Maybe I can post a turd emoji onto my screen. Like, I don't, like, first of all, kudos to these guys that coming up with this idea, but, you know, flags are waving everywhere. And you may have the precise stats here. 62% of their revenues were Microsoft. Microsoft has just announced that they're canceling or lapsing a bunch of the contracts. So it was a big customer concentration. The top line grew to, I can't remember, $1.9 billion.
Yeah, almost 2 billion
Yeah. Well, then
in
start looking
2023.
at, yeah, they have 11 billion of debt. Their EBITDA. So here is some of the stats, Matt, that we were sharing. They have ignore the equity for a moment. You have $11 billion of debt to basically buy the equipment and the data centers. Yet your net operating income before capex was only around $300-ish million. So you have a 3% return on just your debt equity. It's like, Jesus, you would have expected a lot more of net operating income. And then you have to subtract the interest expense. And so
Right.
the question here is, at what scale do you have to be on this sort of a business? And it's just very low margin commodity type returns. And the question really is, are they taking advantage of an immediate market dislocation? The other big yellow flag was the three founders had already liquidated almost $500 million of their personal equity, which was accounting for the vast majority of it before the IPO. So they took their chips right off the table. So when you look at all this, like I just like, again, I'm gonna be wrong, I'm sure, but I was like, man, this thing here just looks like a terrible one to go public. And even when I'm seeing the reports now, it seems like even the media that's reporting on it, they got excited, and now there's this kind of like, is this really the next one that's going to go public?
Yeah, I'm not really sure what to read from some of the media headlines that are coming out. Obviously, the explosive growth they saw, they had 16 million in revenue in 2022 to 1.9
Unbelievable.
billion plus in
Crazy.
2023. Obviously,
Amazing.
there's nearly $1 billion loss in 24, but they're playing in like a space where losses are kind of normalized. And I understand that. Obviously, taking advantage of that 8x growth is important for them to think about. There's a ton of debt on this thing. And so getting to be profitable is going to take some time. It's going to have to prove itself out. And maybe the public markets is a good place for them to be under the microscope. Yes, the concentration of Microsoft is 62% of its contracts. There's another one that gets it to like 72%, I think. So the top two is around 72% of their entire revenue base. And then the founders cashing out 500 million in stock. They're saying that it was to get Fidelity and BlackRock into the mix to show that they have institutional investors. Yes, I know. And then the other part is the founders are still retaining 82% of the voting power due to the special share structure, which is also kind of raising more governance concerns around this whole thing. I'm sure this thing will probably have an interesting debut. And with interest rates maybe coming down, they could also, ride this thing out. But it's a very weird one to be showing to the market at a time like this. So I'm not sure exactly if this is the one people want to use as the benchmark for what's down the pipe. There's news, obviously, that Revolt has filed for an IPO. Discord's in conversations. It feels like there's a lot more coming through.
Yeah. And by the way, I did happen to read the S1 that came out. And there's probably a lot smarter folks that are listening to this, but I can't really figure out what their competitive mode is. And if it's just really a commodity, at the end of the day, they'll get a commodity like return. So that's really the fundamental big question that I had.
They also announced, speaking of CoreWeave, a $1.7 billion purchase right ahead of the IPO for Weights and Biases for $1.7 billion, which is up from its previous valuation of $1.25 billion. So strategic move, obviously expanding CoreWeave's product lineup beyond its big tech clients like Microsoft, and may ease concerns about its concentrated customer base. But man, that's a big one to do right before you go public. Another one that made the headlines, John, is this OpenAI branching out beyond ChatGPT and planning to charge hefty subscription fees of up to $20,000 a month for these so-called PhD level AI agents, basically to reshape how companies pay for AI access to research, coding, and obviously the knowledge worker base. They're talking about how there's going to be 3 tiers for this pricing breakdown: $2,000 a month, which will handle advanced knowledge worker tasks; $10,000 a month for coding focused agents for software development; and $20,000 a month for PhD level research agents for complex inquiries. So the interesting thing about this announcement is we hosted a dinner alongside your former firm, Omer's Ventures, the other day with a bunch of AI founders. And one of the questions we asked them, these are all like early stage seed Series A founders, is what's the one tool that you use daily in your office and your job that did not exist a year ago that you could not live without? And the number one answer was Cursor.dev. So for those who don't know what Cursor is, it's one of the fastest growing companies out there, 0 to 100 million in ARR in 18 months. And basically they take over the entire ability to write code. Anyone who's even non-technical can prompt engineer their way to writing code that actually can be deployed and used. Some people said they would be willing to pay $1 million a year for access to it instead of hiring, 10 engineers for 100 or 200 grand each. So the timing of this announcement is quite interesting. Maybe it's a way to combat some of these developer agents. But what are your thoughts on it, John?
That's an interesting thing on the Cursor.com. The agentic opportunities that I'm seeing, interestingly, a lot of them are trying to go very up market from not providing base level information, but very sophisticated level information where, I saw one just yesterday. It was an LLM for chemical and specialty materials where you would need a PhDs to understand it. So, what was interesting was the verticalization of some of these applications, and you and I have talked about it's really always was going to be at the application layer. And I'm seeing this battle here, and this is a great example of OpenAI. Do they want to have the app layer sitting on top of them, providing those sophisticated, um, value add, or is the LLM going to use their advantage of being an LLM and become the app layer too? OpenAI is clearly trying to achieve both, and I'll be curious to see, could they get into all these specialty areas, or are they going to stay in the fat part of the market and allow all of these niche uh, applications to actually serve those very detailed services?
Yeah, I mean, look, they're going to compete wherever there's money to be spent on high price, high salary roles. That's for sure. And we've always said, like, the highest priced roles are the service economy, right? It's lawyers, it's doctors, it's
Mhm.
consultants. Those types of roles is where they're going after first. And you just heard it here from these founders that we had dinner with. They just said, I'd rather hire a junior developer, give them these tools, these agents, and 10x their output rather than hiring someone for 5 times the amount to get the same kind of output. So there is a demand for this type of tool, and people will be willing to pay maybe 20,000 a month if they're at the forefront of biotech and drug discoveries or something, instead of bringing on PhDs that are demanding 500,000 to $1 million a year.
Yeah, but isn't it just I was just having this discussion with a founder just before you and I were chatting on here. The old measuring stick for the last decade or so was, if you're a founder of a tech company, how many employees are you adding? Is the measurement how many of them are you subtracting and replacing with AI? Uh, you know, there's a social cost, certainly of
Of
that,
course.
but it really is a paradigm shift that if you can pay $20,000 a month but replace ten coders, you've just made your unit economics that much more superior. So that was the bet, and the application of software coding seems to be one of the ones that are having some level of stickiness for sure.
If software coding becomes commoditized, then the output gets risen higher. The quality of what you're selling has to be much better, which means your sales and marketing and your customer
Mm.
service and all those things have to be better. So I think it just raises the bar for everyone then. If that's like your input becomes commoditized, then your output has to be that much better. So I don't think it's going to remove like the competition. I just think it's going to raise the bar, and it may reduce the amount of capital investment needed at the beginning of companies' journeys to get to some product market fit. But eventually, if you really want to scale and own a market, you're still going to need the tens of
Well,
millions that go into these companies.
that's where the scaling always has been, right?
Yeah.
Not building. Like, this is the same discussion that we had before cloud computing. Venture dollars were going into buying hardware and all this sort of
Right.
stuff. And then the view was, oh, now that we get to use cloud computing, you don't have to invest in hard infrastructure. Did the price of
You got
building
more startups.
it
No.
didn't go down. It just got
No.
reallocated.
But funds didn't have to write $5 million to get a company started. They could write 500,000, which is
Correct.
what created YC and all these other things. So yeah,
Correct.
we'll have to see how this one plays out. Until next time, John, thanks for joining us in the tank today.
Great. Thanks, Matt.